HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Kids in the Hall, One Dumb Guy, by Paul Myers. Foreword by Seth Myers. Read by Paul Myers. For Lisa Algar, who inspires me and co-conspires with me every step of the way. Foreword. In 1995, the summer between my junior and senior years of college, I worked in New York City as an intern for Comedy Central. On the first day, my boss led me into a closet cluttered with VHS tapes and told me I had 8 weeks to organize and catalog it. For the first few weeks, I was committed to the job and well on track to complete it as instructed. But then I stumbled upon the complete The Kids in the Hall, and it all went to hell. You see, I grew up in a household without cable. I loved Saturday Night Live and had heard tale of this other edgier Lorne Michaels show that aired on HBO, but had only caught glimpses of it at sleepovers or off bootleg tapes that fellow comedy nerds had brought to campus. And now, here I was with full access, and I was resolved to take advantage of it. Each day I would do the bare minimum of work to not draw attention to myself, and in the spaces in between I watched every episode of every season of this wonderful show. I fell in love. If SNL was the Rolling Stones playing arenas, The Kids in the Hall was an indie band playing a low-ceilinged rock club full of adoring fans. The lo-fi opening credits alone let you know that this was something grittier than you were used to. Sweeping shots of New York City were replaced with Canadian suburbia and parking lots. And while Lorne kept the device of actors finding the lens while their names bounced underneath them, there was no Don Pardo bellowing their identities. You had to read them like liner notes on the back of an album. And soon you learned each of their styles. For precise character work, Mark McKinney was your guy. If you loved foreign films, Bruce McCulloch had the eye of an auteur. Scott Thompson was the open book, sharing himself via monologues unlike anything you've ever seen. And for sharply written premises, it was Kevin McDonald and Dave Foley. Their differing skill sets fit together perfectly. For years I've thought of the 5 of them like a perfectly constructed basketball team, and just now I'm realizing it should have been hockey. It's not like they never mentioned the Maple Leafs. They were so funny, but beyond that they were so decent. When they played women, it was done with integrity and never for a cheap laugh. When they spoke of gay culture, it was as something to be proud of rather than a comic stereotype. In later years, when I found myself writing sketches for a living, I often turned to them as a standard for what I wanted to accomplish. When my summer as a Comedy Central intern ended, I went to my boss for my employee evaluation. He told me that he'd been impressed early on, but that he couldn't help notice how my efforts flagged in the second half of my time there. While he had once considered offering me a job when I graduated, he couldn't in good conscience say that he would now. I admitted that I had allowed myself to become distracted. He asked me what by, and when I told him The Kids in the Hall, he said, "There are worse things to throw an opportunity away for. I don't regret it. Enjoy this book." Seth Myers. Introduction. Here Come the Brides. On a Sunday evening in May 2015, I entered San Francisco's prestigious Warfield Theater to catch up with my old friends, the legendary comedy troupe, The Kids in the Hall. As longtime stage director Jim Milan ushered me backstage, I found the kids distractedly immersed in their various pre-show rituals. As usual, it fell to Kevin McDonald to greet me, offering drinks and snacks before walking me over to a large round table where Mark McKinney nodded hello from behind a newspaper, and Bruce McCulloch broke briefly from a conversation with his wife Tracy to raise an eyebrow in lieu of a verbal greeting. A jittery Scott Thompson darted in and out of the room, seeming to have misplaced something important, while Dave Foley offered me a warm handshake with one hand while nursing a soft drink in the other, having recently gone on the wagon. By this point, I had known the troupe for over 30 years, but while these 5 middle-aged men had long since outgrown their childlike name, very little else seemed to have changed about them since the day we met. While a sense of imminent fun hung over the backstage area, this was not a party. These men were about to go to work at the job they had created for themselves back on the streets of Toronto in the early 80s. As showtime approached, Milan politely asked all visitors to clear the room and take their seats, affording me my first glimpse of the 2,300-plus fans in the sold-out house. Surprisingly, it wasn't all silver foxes like myself. It seemed to me that roughly half the house was comprised of millennials or younger. A large cross-section of these people hadn't even been born when the Kids in the Hall TV series originally aired on network television in the late 1980s. It was entirely possible that for many, this was their first time at a Kids in the Hall live show. As the house lights dimmed, a recording of shadowy men on a shadowy planet's Having an Average Weekend, the official theme for the Kids in the Hall TV series, echoed through the auditorium to cheers of instant recognition. The air was electric. As nostalgia washed over me, I realized that the kids and I had come a long way. Some 30 years and 4,239 kilometers, or 2,634 miles, to be precise. My mind raced back to Toronto in the winter of 1985, to the small club show where I'd first realized that maybe, just maybe, these guys had something special. As in all the best stories, ours opens on a dark and stormy night, when an especially nasty blizzard was heaping obscene amounts of snow upon the city of Toronto. TTC streetcars were backed up all along Queen Street and most major surface routes, and you couldn't get a cab to save your life. Frankly, if you had nothing better to do, you were best advised to stay home under a blanket, preferably near a space heater. Yet some of us daring comedy aficionados did have something better to do. We who had bravely trudged through 6-foot snowdrifts, past cars that wouldn't be dug out until morning, just to get to a tiny cabaret bar called the Rivoli, where a photocopied poster stapled to a telephone pole out front beckoned, "Man the laugh boats, it's the Kids in the Hall." Once safely inside the warm confines of the Riv, we bought our drinks from the bartender and talent booker Carson, and took our seats just as Dave, Kevin, Bruce, Mark, and Scott commandeered 2 cramped but functional stages, and went about the hilarious business of fulfilling their weekly residency. Earlier that afternoon, the 5 kids had huddled backstage to mull over whether they should even play the show at all, operating on the assumption that nobody would make it through the storm or feel much like laughing if they did. Thankfully, they opted to do the show anyway, for themselves, whether anyone showed up or not. The show went on, remembers McDonald, and this became the first night that we had a lineup around the block. We even had to turn people away. After that night, we always had a great audience at the Rivoli. The troupe had been honing their act for months, and I had been laughing along with their uniquely suburban take on social justice, big city life, and institutional hypocrisy. Week after week, I witnessed them creating fresh material out of the ether, developing new characters, and forging a unique comedy aesthetic. While clearly informed by Monty Python's Flying Circus, SCTV, and Saturday Night Live, their highly disruptive comedy was as anarchic as any punk rock show playing in the neighboring bars of the Queen Street Strip. Sure, they were all white males, but in the early 80s, just having one of those white males be openly gay, and not always playing it for laughs, seemed downright revolutionary. While the kids played all the female roles themselves, it never seemed like a campy drag act, and their quote-unquote ladies were frequently the heroes of their scenes. While their name was already age inappropriate, even then they were all in their early to mid-20s, it announced them as perennial outsiders, the punks in the corridor, ready to break into the big room by any means necessary. I discovered the kids early on, and by kismet. After my younger brother, the sketch comedian and writer Mike Myers, had flourished at the Second City Theater's comedy workshops, I found myself following him to class, where soon I too was learning the ways and history of improv comedy, alongside fellow students Kevin McDonald and Dave Foley. I quickly became friends with Kevin and Dave, who told me their troupe had been doing some shows and that I should come see them. As fate would have it, my girlfriend at the time mentioned a comedy troupe she'd heard about that featured a fellow student at York University named Scott. All roads led to the Rivoli. Over the coming months, as Toronto thawed out and warmed up, so too did the buzz around the Kids in the Hall. Eventually that buzz translated into a career in television, and I became a regular member of the studio audience for their live tapings. Soon our secret was out, and their names spread across the country and beyond. Just as SCTV had put Canadian comedy on the map, the Kids in the Hall updated it and made it even cooler. As they moved into film and theater tours, various tensions within the troupe would at times threaten their fragile union, but like any 30-year marriage, they have somehow made it work. As the curtain opened at the Warfield in 2015, the marriage analogy was underlined by the sight of all 5 kids in bridal gowns, symbolically reaffirming their vows through classic sketches, while offering new material just as they had back in those chilly Rivoli days. After the show, Kevin told me that while these 5 strong-willed individuals would probably always find something to fight over, this same tension was also the secret to their longevity. Just like their fictional garage rock band, Rod Torfelson's Armada, featuring Herman Menderchuk, there have been times in the kids' career when they questioned if they were going to make it. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always fun. As a troupe, they've often made risky artistic choices, and probably shot themselves in the foot more than once. But according to McDonald, the state of their union is as strong as ever. We create most of our own problems, he tells me. Then we're sad about it. But later on, we can see the humor. I think it helps us write better sketches. I always say that individually we're all smart guys, but collectively we're really just one dumb guy. What follows constitutes the inside story of how that one dumb guy managed to create some of the funniest sketch comedy ever performed, and inspired their peers and subsequent generations of sketch comedians to create programs such as Mr. Show with Bob and David, The State, The Ben Stiller Show, Portlandia, Key and Peele, and most recently, Baroness Von Sketch Show. Today, the kids in the hall still make me laugh whenever I see them or their work, and despite cheating death and worse, they're still here. The story of just how they got here begins in earnest in the province of Alberta, when a young drunk punk named Bruce McCulloch met a well-traveled diplomat's son named Mark McKinney. 1. Mark and Bruce cut loose at the Moose. Bruce Ian McCulloch was born on May 12, 1961, in Edmonton, Alberta, where, like many future comedians, he got his first laughs in his first-grade classroom. My teacher would say something like, "I told you umpteen times not to do that," McCulloch recalls. So I said, "Yes, but you didn't tell me how many umpteen was." She actually laughed, and then the whole class laughed, and I was like, oh, that's what it feels like to make a joke and be funny. His middle name came from his father, Ian McCulloch, a hard-drinking traveling salesman who, despite being a mean drunk, was also something of a bohemian, possessed of a sharp sense of humor and a healthy respect for the arts, comedy in particular. My dad was kind of a Willy Loman figure, says McCulloch, but he also played the bass in clubs and loved jazz and weird comedy records. I remember liking the buttoned-down mind of Bob Newhart and Woody Allen's stand-up comic, and my dad telling me how fortunate he felt to have seen Lenny Bruce in concert one time in Montreal. A bright kid, McCulloch began to cultivate his own sense of humor as a coping mechanism to process his father's frequent bouts of drunken rage and other exploits, including one time when he crashed the family car. It was not unusual for young Bruce to lie awake in bed while his dad blasted out his Dave Brubeck records downstairs at all hours of the morning. Poetically, he remembers this time as a beige wasteland of cigarette smoke and complacency where nothing was really going on for me. Things changed radically when he was 8 years old and his mother, June Hicks, filed for divorce, leaving Bruce and his sister Heather to follow their dad to Winnipeg, Manitoba, to live with their new stepmother, Connie Buchanan. It would be nearly 2 years before Bruce saw his biological mother again. My parents had an old-fashioned 60s divorce, says McCulloch, where I wasn't allowed to mention my mom's name or even have a picture of her in my room. When I was entering junior high, we moved to Calgary, and my life kind of started. All was a clever student. Bruce's grades began to suffer after the divorce and relocation. By now, his comedy coping mechanism was second nature, and he found that being funny and weird helped him to navigate a confusing emotional landscape. Only now he had discovered that athletics were a great way to work off some of the teen angst, and he showed genuine promise as a competitive powerlifter and a star athlete, albeit a quirky one. My nickname was Power Jerk, says McCulloch, because I was both powerful and a jerk. McCulloch would remain obsessed with sports until he was 14 years old, when fate introduced him to a 16-year-old aspiring musician named Reed Diamond. The two became fast friends, and Diamond, already possessed of his own sense of style, mentored McCulloch in the counterculture, steering him away from athletics and introducing him to the joys of alcohol and exotic British rock records. For a while I gave up football, says McCulloch, because the guys that did sports were kind of losers. But I soon got back into wrestling, powerlifting, and taking solo bike trips, all that stuff. It's funny, I've been distance running since I was 11, and even when we'd all party all night, I'd wake up and go for a run. All my rock friends thought I was a fag, but I did it anyway. In a futile effort to fit in and be a cool kid, McCulloch attempted to keep his sense of humor to himself. When Diamond heard that McCulloch was funny, he confronted him about it. Reed said, "Hey, I just met someone who says you're funny. You're not funny," McCulloch remembers. Up until then, I had kept my comic side hidden from him. But it became harder and harder to hide, because, in that very cliched way, I had discovered that being funny could get me out of trouble in school. Still, it would be a few years before McCulloch found an outlet for his funny side. And in the meantime, he plunged deeper into a pattern of drinking, fighting, and rock and roll. He remembers feeling quote-unquote rudderless and uncertain much of the time, fearing that he might end up just another funny guy at some factory somewhere, riffing around the snack machine at break time. I never thought there was a possibility to pursue the arts in my life, says McCulloch. When you read the autobiographies of Bob Dylan or Patti Smith, they both say they had no idea what they were going to do with their creativity. They were just wandering around. I was like that too. I had absolutely no thought that my individuality or my weird worldview could get me anywhere. Reed and I just did weird and elaborate things. When he was 15, he would try out gags on his girlfriend. One time I waited 25 minutes for her to come over while wearing a paper bag on my head with "Welcome" written on it, McCulloch recalls. Another time I sent her a dead fish through the mail with a note card saying, "Don't worry, there's not a dead fish in here." I remember it really made her mom mad at me. Most weekends in the mid-1970s, your average teenager could be found huddled around a television set late at night, cracking up over the latest revolution in comedy, Saturday Night Live. McCulloch, on the other hand, preferred to stay out late on the weekends seeing bands, crashing parties, drinking, and sometimes fighting. Watching TV was for losers, he recalls. Even later on, when people said they wanted to go to a movie on the weekend, I thought, "You fucking loser." One day, Diamond introduced Bruce to another musician friend of his who lived out in Calgary's Braeside district, guitarist and budding illustrator Brian Connolly. Diamond and Connolly were dead set on starting a band, and their sheer confidence made a lasting impression on McCulloch. But he was not a musician, and remembers feeling left out. "These guys were my world at the time," says McCulloch. "They knew what they wanted, but I didn't know what I was going to do, so I was doubly lost. Even though I knew I had a special brain, I began to carry this sadness, like I was destined to be a loser." At the time, Calgary offered few opportunities for a young artist to nurture and cultivate his sensitive soul. The oil boomtown was still mostly rural, populated by tough manual laborers, stiff-suited oil executives, and actual Stetson-wearing cowboys ripping up the main drag in their loud-ass pickup trucks. For McCulloch, this was a lonely place to be. There were some pretty girls, but there were very few kind girls, and certainly no artistic girls that I knew of. If you went to a bar and you didn't look like a cowboy, you'd get beat up. If you used words with too many syllables, you were quote-unquote gay. During his final year at high school, McCulloch's estranged mother asked him to move in with her, and for a time, her basement offered him a pleasant sanctuary. June had become a real estate agent and was frequently out showing properties, so McCulloch had the run of the place, inviting his weightlifting friends over after their meets. But things changed drastically after what he now refers to as the quote-unquote Tequila Fest, an infamous competitive drinking event wherein he and his fellow lifters attempted to consume their own weight in alcohol. The morning after the gathering, June returned home to find her son passed out on the front yard, curled up in the fetal position and encased in a cocoon of silly string and vomit. What she saw inside the house was even worse. Broken furniture, vomit-stained carpets, and more passed-out teens. She was so shocked by the carnage, McCulloch remembers, that she staggered back to the front yard and suffered a heart attack right there on her own front steps. During the slow recovery period that followed, June saw her commission-based sales dry up, leading to the bank foreclosing on her home. When June moved in with his sister Heather, McCulloch was told he was unwelcome. At just 19 years old, Bruce found himself homeless, with no money, no prospects, and no idea of what to do next. As he later wrote in his memoir, Let's Start a Riot, he came to the profound realization that we are all only 3 bad breaks away from living in a cardboard fort. For the first time in his young life, Bruce McCulloch was truly on his own. In search of financial security, Bruce struggled through a succession of odd jobs that included handing out flyers and hawking Ginsu steak knives. He was growing up fast and realized that he had to step off the treadmill before it crushed him entirely. He opted to go back to school, enrolling in business and public relations courses at Calgary's Mount Royal Community College. Bruce assumed it would be easy to suppress his true nature if it could lead him to a normal and lucrative career as a quote-unquote suit. But it was not to be. I tried very hard to stuff down my personality and get into the world of business, says McCulloch. It didn't suit me at all. I hated it. Inevitably, his personality would leak out in subtly subversive acts of creative rebellion, such as wearing pajamas to class or adopting eccentric social personas. His fear of the antiseptic, quote-unquote straight life pushed him toward creative outlets such as comedy and writing for the college paper. Viewed in the context of his tortured adolescence, it is hardly surprising that McCulloch gravitated toward the microscopic Calgary punk rock scene. He and Diamond spent many nights at the Calgarian, a local music venue that was a favorite roadhouse for touring punk bands from out of town, including DOA from British Columbia, Husker Du from Minnesota, and Black Flag from Southern California. Watching their tour buses pull out of town, McCulloch began harboring dreams of his own escape from Calgary while he actively pursued his own performance career around town. I did a little comedy music, says McCulloch. I played my bass and a drum machine, and I'd sing some songs I'd written, like Girl Trouble or An Ode to Shoes. Calgary was a small and rough little upstart scene. Really, it was just a handful of guys at the time. Diamond and Connolly soon left Calgary to pursue their punk rock dream in Toronto, and before long they began urging McCulloch to join them. If he wanted to make it, they told him, Toronto was the place to be. With a standing invitation to crash with Diamond and Connolly at their Toronto rooming house, McCulloch made his first visits to check out the city for himself. In those days, you could fly on half a ticket, the return portion of someone else's flight, with no questions asked, says McCulloch. Of course, you could never do that today, but in those days I would answer someone's want ad and pay, say, $60 to some nervous guy selling his unused seat. Then I'd fly to Toronto on someone else's name. It was a different time. Compared to Calgary, Toronto was practically New York City. With its wider selection of punk bars and record stores, he could pick up the latest Viletone single or check out the Toronto and New York bands who played seminal clubs like The Edge, The Turning Point, or Larry's Hideaway every night of the week. Toronto was super influential on me, says McCulloch, and I'd always go home with my mind blown. After a few of these trips, the Calgary punk scene began to feel claustrophobic, and a little too violent for his budding artistic sensibilities. In some ways I'm tough, McCulloch admits, but I'm also a little soft. I wasn't so into that whole Black Flag thing. I didn't want to shave my head and jump off a stage. If there'd been emo back then, I might have been caught up in that. I was as much into the New York Dolls and T-Rex as I was into the Sex Pistols. Up until that point, Bruce had been equally fascinated by both comedy and rock and roll. He knew he'd have to pick one, and eventually concluded that only under the banner of comedy could he have the freedom and flexibility to convey the breadth of his passions. He admits that his reasoning was informed by the arrogance of youth. I naively thought that I was the smartest and funniest guy in the world, but once I made the decision to pursue comedy, all of my art, including my songs, were in a comedy vein. A few months later, Bruce made the significant decision to accompany a few of his friends to watch an evening of improvised theater sports sketch comedy. Sitting in the audience at Calgary's Loose Moose Theater, McCulloch says, he instantly felt at home there. The sports half of theater sports intrigued him. Improv teams competed and worked their way up a house league bracket, while a panel of judges would blow their whistles from the sidelines when a sketch was dead on arrival. The audience was also part of the show and encouraged to throw foam quote-unquote boo bricks at the stage when a scene failed. It was competitive and sometimes cruel, but the performers seemed fearless, if a little crazy. Bruce thought the improvisers, among them Frank and Tony Totino, Jim Curry, Kathleen Foreman, and Dennis Cahill, were the coolest people he had ever seen. This, he thought, was a form of comedy that promised both the structure to build upon and the freedom to move comedically within it. It was exhilarating, McCulloch recalls. I just stared up at that stage. I had found my place, and even though I had no idea how to get up there, I literally told myself, this is what I'm going to do with my life. Fortuitously, McCulloch chanced upon the Totino brothers enjoying a little post-show cheesecake at a cafe on 4th Street. Offstage, they seemed less like rock stars. Stammering, Bruce approached them and asked how he could get into theater sports. The next day, he took their advice and enrolled in the Loose Moose Workshop program, studying scene work and learning the comedy systems of their founder, the influential British sketch comedy guru, Keith Johnstone. You could tell that Keith was not from here, says McCulloch, mostly because he wore skidoo boots well into May. Johnstone's improvisation ethos was exemplified by the motto, "Don't be prepared." And most of the improvised scene work on the Loose Moose stage drew on instinct coupled with an aggressive, athletic approach to finding authentic yet comedic stage interactions. Keith was always at the periphery in the workshop, says McCulloch, but most of my actual classes were with Jim Curry or the Totino brothers. Keith's advice was simple: just make things up, try not to be boring, but don't try to be interesting either. At first, I wasn't very good at it, and I can still remember walking up those stairs to the theater, panicking and thinking, oh my God, I have to be funny. It was intense, and after each session, I'd just go home and think all week about what happened in class. In a relatively short time, McCulloch was invited to test his newly acquired skills in front of a paying crowd on the Loose Moose stage. With no choice but to sink or swim, he quickly became conversant in the basics of sketch comedy and, as his confidence grew, he waded into solo pieces and even performed 5 minutes of nascent stand-up comedy that relied less on jokes and more on beat poetry and observational monologues. I went out with weird stuff, admits McCulloch, and I refused to do relatable things like complaining about airline food. It was this sort of bizarro performance art. But I discovered that I was a natural. Still, my monologues were secondary to the sketch stuff, and I'd only do a couple of minutes and then go back to sketches. Even if he'd wanted to pursue stand-up, Calgary had nowhere for him to do it. During his next visit to Toronto early in 1981, Bruce checked out Mark Breslin's legendary stand-up venue, Yuck Yucks, but left feeling unsatisfied. It was so gross, says McCulloch. I mean, eventually I saw some great guys there, but not on those first few nights. Similarly, a trip to Toronto's Second City left him underwhelmed by what he saw as quote-unquote corny piano music, accompaniment to predictable topical sketches employing those fucking wooden chairs. There were probably some great minds at Second City, says McCulloch, but they were hidden under the architecture of the institution it had become. Back at Theater Sports, McCulloch was part of a two-man team called Jerry's Kids, with future DreamWorks animator Andrew Pearce. While they did well, week after week, things kicked into high gear when Jerry's Kids was drafted into what was then the hottest team at the Loose Moose, the Audience. According to McCulloch, the Audience seemed to be going places. They'd even made up little buttons that said The Audience, which blew my mind. I was a little younger than them, so I just looked up to those guys. I thought they were so great. In actual fact, they weren't particularly skilled at the time, but they were naturals. The Audience, at one time or another, included Bill Gemmell, Gary Campbell, Norm Hiscock, Frank Van Keegan, and a particularly intense performer named Mark McKinney. One of my first memories of Mark, says McCulloch, was him rehearsing for too long on the stage with the piano guy for some piano thing. And I'm sitting there heckling them going, how fucking long are you going to be rehearsing? You've been on stage for half our rehearsal. Despite the initial tension, the two hit it off, if tentatively, and began a friendship based on mutual admiration and begrudging respect. We weren't like the best friends in the world, says McCulloch, but we each looked across the room and saw another guy playing an instrument.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?